I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles this morning to Exodus chapter 3, the third chapter of the second book of the Bible. And our focal verse for today is Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, as we continue in this series on the Old Testament in 12 verses. Last week, the verse was in Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Abraham to go forth from his land, from his father's house, from the country that he knew, and that God would bless him and make him a blessing in the world. Today we are with Moses at the burning bush, and chapter 3, verse 7 of the book of Exodus says this: "The Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings." And so we continue in our series this day on the Old Testament in 12 verses, which is designed to help us kind of befriend and get at least a little bit familiar with the main messages of this very old and often very confusing part of our Bibles. Last week we began, as I said, in Genesis 12 with the story of surprising beginnings. Out of the deepening darkness and corruption and evil that is described in Genesis chapters 3 through 11, God makes us a new start by calling this elderly couple, a man and his wife, Abram and Sarai, to come and walk with him into a new future, into a future filled with blessing, not only for them, but for the family that will come from them. Not just for the family that God will miraculously provide for them, but through that family, blessing that will flow to all the peoples of the earth. For the whole world, God has blessing that will come through Abram and his descendants. And the rest of the book of Genesis narrates the story of Abram and Sarai and their family. It continues on into the second generation with their sons Ishmael and Isaac and the adventures and troubles that befell them. Then into the third generation with Isaac and his wife Rebekah and their twin sons Esau and Jacob, who fought and fought and fought with one another and with everyone else around them, it seems, and who yet became the recipients of blessing. It continues into the fourth generation with Jacob, who wrestled with God and who became known as Israel, who had 12 sons born of 4 different women. All of the struggles and troubles and of this broken and divided family, who were somehow still the recipients of blessing and the bearers of blessing to others. The book of Genesis ends with the whole family now down in Egypt, where they have fled to escape a famine in the land of Canaan. They are living under the protection of the Egyptian king, Pharaoh, who has been the recipient of great blessing through this family, specifically through one of the youngest sons, Joseph, who through tragic circumstances continued to experience the favor of God and to become a bearer of blessing to Pharaoh and to the whole nation of Egypt. Well, the beginning of the book of Exodus, with the passage of time, the Egyptian empire that has sheltered this family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that has been blessed and has been rescued from destruction through this family, through the wisdom of Joseph, well, they gradually forget that history. And it says in Exodus 1, verse 8, that a new king arose who did not know Joseph. And this new king begins to lead his family, his people, to oppress and to enslave these Israelite people. They oppressed Abraham's family with hard labor, turning them into slaves, into units of production, into cogs in a machine designed to bring forth as much work as possible. But still the blessing of God was very evident upon this family, this people of Israel now that Abraham and Sarai's 2 sons had grown into this large family. But the more they were oppressed, it says in Exodus 1:12, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And so then Pharaoh instituted a system of systematic genocide, ordering the deaths of all the Israelite baby boys who were born. We don't have time to fill in the details as told in Exodus 1 and 2, but it's a terrible and horrifying story. In chapter 2, we're introduced to the man who will become the unlikely hero of this story of the book, a man whose life is almost snuffed out in the genocide that Pharaoh is inflicting upon the people of Israel. And the horror of this genocide sits heavy in Exodus chapter 2. Weeping and mourning of distraught parents echo throughout the story of Moses' salvation from the waters of the very river that was meant to kill him. Moses grew from a miraculously preserved baby to the murderer of an Egyptian who he saw oppressing one of his fellow Israelites, to a fugitive, to a wanderer in a foreign land, to being a husband and a father, and ultimately a sojourner, as he describes himself in chapter 2, verse 22, a foreigner in a foreign land, far off to the east of Egypt. Here he is, a Hebrew who had been raised in the palace of the Egyptian Pharaoh. Raised as an Egyptian, Moses lives now a desert dweller's life of sheep herding and wandering in the wilderness of Midian. Back in Egypt, a land now far away from Moses, his Hebrew people are suffering in slavery. Oppression and bondage increase to the breaking point. And as readers, we can sense the depth of groaning and the cries of people with no voice, with no one to listen to them. Just before our story begins, in chapter 3, in the last couple of verses of chapter 2, we'll read them and get the sense of how life was for God's people. After a long time, this king of Egypt, who had begun this system of genocide, died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out for the system that he had established continued on. It was now very beneficial to the economy of Egypt for this large group of people within it to be their slaves. And so they continued in their slavery, and their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Now, at other times when I've preached on this amazing story, we've noticed lots and lots of different details, and it's an incredibly rich story full of details that will bless us as we spend time studying it. Sorry about this microphone. This doesn't seem to want to work today. Let me get this mic a bit closer so it'll pick up my voice better, I hope. We could talk a little bit, if we wanted to, about the setting of the story. Moses is having a very ordinary day, a boring day on the job, herding sheep in the back country of the wilderness of the desert, in a place called Horeb, which literally means wasteland. Not exactly a promising kind of place to expect to find a visitation from God. But it gives us a powerful reminder that God can break through to meet us and to change our lives, even in the least promising of times or places. We could talk about the miracle that God used to grab Moses' attention, this burning bush that does not burn up, a symbol of an irresistible being whose energies can never be dissipated or contained, and who is not subject to any kind of decay or deterioration. God uses nature here as a vehicle for revealing that which is outside of nature, and to draw Moses' attention to the word that he has for Moses and for the people. It turns out that this unknown one who calls to Moses out of the bush is not so unknown after all, because he introduces himself as the God who had worked in the lives of Moses' ancestors many years before, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had shown abundant compassion and miraculous power to previous generations of Moses' own family. As I said, there are many rich details we could dwell upon, but I want to get to the heart of the passage, this verse 7 that I read. Let's land for a while on this declaration that God makes in verses 7 and following. As God continues to speak to Moses here, we're given a glimpse into the very heart of this deity, of this God. We begin to understand what it means to say that God is holy. And basically it means God is different. God is uncomparable. God is unlike any other God or leader or authority. It's amazing. He says, I have observed, or I have seen the misery of my people in Israel. I have seen what is happening to them. I'm not oblivious to it. More intimately, for you can see from a long distance away, but he says, I have heard their cry. I've heard their weeping. I've heard the cries under the lash of the whip of those who are enslaving them. Indeed, I know their sufferings. I am acquainted, I am familiar with their sufferings, not knowing from afar, knowing from intimately close, right up there with them. And I have come. I have seen, I have heard, I know, I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land, to a good and spacious land. Maybe we're so used to hearing this kind of thing that familiarity has bred contempt or at least boredom in us. The fact of the matter that this is just not the way that gods, kings, emperors, presidents, prime ministers, the authority structures of our world, it's not the way that they typically act or feel or think. This is different. Holy, holy, holy indeed. I have indeed seen the misery of my people. Other gods don't see the misery of people. Zeus doesn't see people's misery. Baal doesn't see people's misery. The gods of Egypt surely don't care about the people's misery. Emperors don't. But this holy God does. He sees the misery. It is not unknown to him when you and I are suffering. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. Again, other gods aren't like that. And again, notice that you can see from afar, but to hear the cries, the whimper of a child, the weeping of a mother, the groaning of a slave under a heavy load, you have to be close up to hear that. And God hears. God is not watching us from a distance. He's up close and personal with the sufferings of the oppressed. But it gets better. I know their suffering. Maybe your translation says something different, like the NIV that says, I'm concerned about their suffering, but that seems weaker than the original. This is, I know their suffering in the way that a husband and wife know one another, an intimate knowledge, an intimate familiarity, a relationship of close proximity, of shared experience. You can't know someone in this sense from a distance. You can only know them in this sense from the depths of a personal relationship in which hearts and lives are shared together with one another. God, far from being merely concerned about their sufferings, has intimately experienced it. God is here depicted as one who is personally involved in the sufferings of the people. He has so entered into their sufferings as to have felt deeply the pain of what they are having to endure. God has chosen not to remain safe and secure in some heavenly abode or domain, untouched by the sorrows of the world, but is internally related to the sufferings, entering fully into the oppressive situation and making it his own. I have seen, I have heard, I know. What a different God. Holy, holy, holy. Lord God Almighty. But it gets even better. I have seen, I have heard, I know, and I have come. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to the good and broad land that I first promised to Abraham, my friend. God's suffering with the people does not immobilize God, does not kill God, does not stop God. It does not make God powerless in the face of the suffering. Indeed, just the opposite. The suffering of God is a powerful force which focuses the divine energies upon this situation of suffering. So God says, I am coming. God will do for Israel what Israel cannot do for itself. And then comes the kicker. Then comes the challenge. God has seen, God has heard, God knows, God has come. Now, Moses, go. And don't we kind of wish a lot of times that that fifth part wasn't there? God would just do it all. God would just do all the delivering. No, he seeks a human partner. God's mission in this world to free the oppressed from their oppressors and into a place of abundance and peace is not something that God intends to do independently of his human partners, of this family of Abraham. He's raised up Moses for this very purpose and preserved his life through the early years that were so full of peril, through the long, interminable years of wandering in the backside of the wilderness with this sense of, who in the world am I? This man who has this muddled sense of identity, now God calls and says, go, Moses, you are the man. You are the one I want to use. And he's openly astonished that this compassionate, justice-loving God of the bush, that what God intends to do is to be done by none other than Moses himself. Pretty mind-blowing. And we can see that Moses' mind was pretty blown by it too, because there's verse after verse after verse of excuses and obfuscations and questions about what about this and what about that, and God, I don't want to go. His response carries on beyond the end of chapter 3 on into the next chapter and picks up again in chapters 5 and 6. First, he's not adequate or worthy. Then he doesn't know enough about this God. Then he doesn't think the people will listen. And then blah, blah, blah. On and on go the excuses. On and on go the reasons why Moses doesn't think this is a good idea. And it's amazing how hard we try to fight to avoid our God-given mission and destiny in this world. It's tragic. God keeps answering each and every excuse, each and every way that Moses tries to wriggle out of this calling. Keeps on saying, I am, I will be. I'll be there with you, Moses. I'll be working in and through you. In fact, it's my very name. I am that I am. I will be what I will be. Or you might even say the sense of this word that God takes for his name has the sense of I cause to be, I bring into being. So Moses, go and do what I'm telling you, and I will bring into being the you that you need to be. I will bring into being the gifts in you that you need to exercise in order to be my instrument of deliverance for my people. He will not let Moses or us off the hook. He keeps answering every excuse by trying to help Moses and us understand what it means that he will be with us in every fearful eventuality, in every dreaded twist in our path, in every courage-sapping circumstance, in every anxiety-causing situation, no matter what it is we're imagining could go wrong as we live out God's call, God's presence as the life giver, as the one who causes things to be, makes all the difference. So this verse, Exodus 3:7, and the story in which it is embedded, express two powerful themes that are present throughout the entire Old Testament. Themes that as we befriend and seek to get to know this part of our Bible, themes that are dominant throughout it. One, God is a God who saves, a God who delivers the oppressed, who is on the side of the suffering. And secondly, that God works through his covenant people to be instruments of that deliverance in the lives of others. That was true then and there. It's true here and now. God is here, mighty to save, strong to deliver. God still sees and hears and knows and cares deeply and comes alongside to help us. He can deliver you in whatever predicament, whatever bondage you may find yourself in. He can deliver you from the powers of sin and death and evil. Place your trust in him and pray to him that that would be real in your life. And then secondly, prepare to arise and become an instrument of that deliverance in the lives of others, for he still calls weak and frail human beings to be agents of deliverance and good news for others as well. To this, you and I are called as Moses was. Maybe we've been reluctant to answer that call. Well, so was Moses, and so we can forgive ourselves for the reluctance we've expressed in the past, the resistance we might feel even now. But let's let it go, shall we? Take hold of the promise wrapped up in God's very name, I cause to be, and let him make you what you need to be so that you can be an agent of his deliverance. Courageously fulfill his call. May it be.